The colonial matrix was firstly articulated by theorist Aníbal Quijano in 2000 to analyze the domain of coloniality in the areas of authority, gender, sexuality, economics, and epistemology. The colonial matrix was later conceptualized by the art curator Odie in 2018 to think about, quote, technology as a new driver of colonization, now disguised as globalization, quote. In this paper, I introduce the concept of the colonial matrix of subjectivation as an analytic framework for tracing the construction and confinement of transsubjectivities in the global south. This lecture will not obey a linear chronology of time, but will go back and forth through it. Chrononormativity is violence, an organizing mode of cognition and control of time which creates a defined path for life trajectories. As Rashida Phillips from Black Quantum Futurism has argued, quote, Western culture has institutionalized its images of the future by way of religion and politics, making sure that the future can be made predictable and controlled. Time governs our social interactions and regulates our motions, movements, and frames our worldviews and informs our politics. Quote, this begs for the question of who is allowed in this notion of future. The linear fiction of modernity and progress has informed which subjects have been prioritized in capitalism to receive resources needed for survival. The impact of government protection or lack thereof has an effect on the small and large decisions that are made on a day-to-day basis. Poverty in trans, queer, Black, and Indigenous communities is this project's design. Poverty and surveillance produce violence, and both produce subjectivity in circularity. For transgender people living under these constraints, their time has been stolen. This necropolitical timeline is not simply murder, but also suffocation through surveillance resulting from restrictions of access, judicial criminalization, religious demonization, and medical pathologization. In Abya Yala, trans activist movements are organizing to redistribute resources amongst those who have been isolated by the systemic trajectory of colonialism, by building grassroots political infrastructures that ensure access to safe housing, security, in food, in tech, and so on. For travesti theorist Marlene Guayar, transgenocide in Abya Yala has included the annihilation of transsubjectivities and is an effect of the dominating forces of what I call cisgender fundamentalism and the project of ciscoloniality. As Fran Demetrio and Gillian Dissor have argued, colonialism could erase traces and intuitions. Or as Restrepo and Rojas described, the subalternization of knowledge through establishing epistemic hierarchies motivated by the genealogy of this pattern of power. Following Rashida Phillips from Black Quantum Futurism, to critically disavow institutions that uphold hidden timeframes of brutalizing necrocontinuity, we must first understand the mechanics of confinement. How does this confinement construct subjectivity within linear temporal trajectories? When we think about the strategies of subalternization, it is important to think that in the territories of Abya Yala, as Godoy argues, the racial division of the world was installed to preserve what Foucault would call a biological heritage. And I would add here an epistemic heritage of a white heterosexual endo-cisgender subject. Racialization and genderization render one legible or illegible as human within this structure, thus demonstrating the complex entwinement of white supremacy and cisgender supremacy. Through the work of Francisco Godoy in El capítulo de la imposición subjetiva de la supremacía blanca, we understand that, quote, the bodies identified as Indios were framed as beasts, a condition often linked to cannibalism and sexual deviancy. Through the printing press, this imaginary of the Indios as cannibals, sodomites, drunkards, and idolaters would be widely disseminated by the 16th century engravings created by Theodore de Bry, a European engraver who had personally not visited these territories, but who constructed these images from accounts of conquerors and chroniclers. Quote, in medieval Europe, the role of the printing press in distributing images of so-called congenital deformities constituted a form of communication with widespread reach and capitalized on a sensationalist form of entertainment based on the fear of the other. Litvinsneva and Wagner present historical data on this topic. On the 15th and 16th century, even skin conditions would be depicted as monstrous and would be interpreted as, quote, bad omens. The catalogs of scientific illustrator Aldrovandi created a system of meanings that reflected the body politics of the time. Semiotically, monstrosity was an indicative of an urgent divine warning, an apocalyptic threat to the moral order. The body politics of medieval monstrosity also served to identify people who would be intersex or gender nonconforming. It relied on the uncertainties of reproduction and the gestation of pathological subjects. This biomedical device and its associated taxonomies are permeated by the epistemic values of those who created it. Here, beasts, animals, and monsters are iterations of the same, the antagonistic opposite of humans. Where there is a beast, there can be no humanity, much less sanity, since it is the monsters that carry disease. As theorist Legacy Russell argues, being the other is an ontological virus, an antibody, or a glitch. For author Denise Ferreira da Silva, uncertainty is part of, quote, the staples of modern racial grammar, quote. The figure of the monster today is recurrent in reactionary discourses to delegitimize the struggles and identities of oppressed people, and often reflect the dehumanization of transcorporeality, as Cochrane might argue. Instability and uncertainty pathologize and frame subjectivities. The deliberate mechanisms of misrepresentation of information, together with the creation of systems of meaning that design polarizing narratives about the others, are still distributed from official institutions. For Paraguayan author and art critic Ticio Escobar, the systems of meaning produced within this medieval genealogy remain very present if we consider fear-based misinformation and the precarization of education and culture funding cutbacks. These imagery repertoires of the medieval monster trace a pattern of how Europe would interpret Abiyala based on race and gender. And to paraphrase Litvinsneva and Wagner, monstrosity constitutes a means of communication between the liminal spaces of the known and the unknown, between that which is objective and that which is subjective, as Godoy suggests. During the 2010s, the meme of a racialized and fat travesti sex worker named Maritza, who have claimed to have felt disrespected by a cisgender customer, went viral on social media. The interview belonged to a national broadcaster. In it, Maritza claims that 10,000 guaraníes, or approximately $2 that the customer offered her, was not sufficient compensation for her services. A verbal altercation between Maritza and the customer and another travesti followed. Live on television, she decries the dehumanization to which she was subjected. The clip, edited to induce a comedic effect, went viral on YouTube and remained popular throughout the decade, becoming a multi-platform social media joke. The meme of Maritza. The laughable is constituting the politics of respectability, just one of many which have served to communicate transmonstrosity in a colonial way. Unlike the printed illustrations of medieval times, is now audible and infinitely reproducible, for instance, for instantaneous global mass distribution. Trans bodies are cannibalized within imaginaries, using digital technologies to uphold this colonial order. The meme was later appropriated by cisgender artists who capitalized on the catchphrases which came from it. By turning Maritza's complaint into an artistic practice, ongoing colonial extraction takes place. Her complaint is instrumentalized and rendered as a consumer object, devoid of critical content. What is evident here is that the material basis of reparation politics hasn't arrived, nor the trauma of mass media exposure has been addressed, despite Maritza's objection to it. Under this operation of aestheticizing poverty, precariousness becomes an object of consumption. An anti-trans misogynist advocate is devoured by the colonial art system and reduced to an object fetish. The trans feminine body is not only expelled from the domain of life, but is ultimately stripped of her rage. The conditions that shape this art production are the same conditions that shape the life trajectories of trans bodies. Attention to trans bodies alternates between transphobia and transphilia, as Moreno might argue, maximum disgust and fetishistic fascination. two perspectives that fall under the same logic, the expulsion of other bodies. Sofia Moreno addresses the Western art world's transphilia continuum, a term she borrows from Fanon's black skin, white masks. While trans bodies may be experiencing a new art world visibility, this visibility is more often than not driven by dynamics of fetishization. This trend taking place at the peripheries of Western art worlds is informed by the dynamics of the current global economy. At the same time that the colonial system installs mechanisms to pulverize subjectivity, it also installs mechanisms to, quote, save, quote, some subjects and subjectivities from its most devastating and alienating effects. As Godoy argues, within the official religious discourse of the 1600s, quote, charity and evangelization policies were established by Jesuit priests. These charity policies responded to the hierarchical configuration of subjectivities that Catholic discourse would construct in order to perpetuate the possibility of salvation in poverty. Quote, Godoy identifies the Catalan missionary Pedro Kleber as, quote, the founder of the white savior industrial complex and proto-international cooperant defender of human rights in its most westernizing contemporary aspect. That is to say, founded on a principle of maintaining the status quo of the racial division of the world that is protected behind the cloak of charity and solidarity. Quote. Today, humanity is granted by providing platforms for visibility. Charity, in a way, mirrors what has happened in the last decade with trans communities in NGO systems. Much of this method of scarcity exposure in exchange for funding has benefited from the precariousness and urgency that places trans bodies in marginalized places, in the absence of having their basic needs covered. The Western world is built on promises of progress, and with it, the restitution of what has been destroyed. Under this NGO discourse, trans feminine communities in the global south have been promised the improvement of their living conditions in exchange for exposure of their narratives of precariousness. Under the argument that the public's lack of knowledge about their narratives is what prevents their insertion into a systems of support and distribution of resources. Trans activist insurgencies in the global south and global north question whether visibility only serves to reinforce the supremacy of a colonial regime that mediates access to resources, but does not destabilize the foundation of the apparatus that accumulates wealth, which relies on the marginalization and dehumanization and now assimilation of transsubjectivities. Visibility has a limited scope of action and often profits from subalternities re-experiencing traumatic events in a loop, as those whose narratives of precarity are circulated without remuneration. As I previously wrote in Postgenitalist Fantasies, Temporalities of Latin American Trans Art, the Jesuit and Franciscan missions in Paraguay opened wood carving workshops following a European model of instruction. It is important to understand the cognitive effects on colonized people of this prioritization of the ocular. This privileging of the eye and the hierarchies that come with it still define not only bodies and stories, but also desires. The Madrid-based art collective, Colectivo Ayú, points out that Spanish colonizers often gave mirrors to indigenous people in exchange for gold. The mirrors helped establish a regime of referentiality around whiteness, differentiating the colonizer from the colonized and imposing ontological categories of objectivity and subjectivity. Artist Ariane Carrillo aims to fool the objectifying cis-gay through the use of fragmented mirrors. Carrillo's work, titled Tengo más de dos vistas y están todas borrosas, translated as I have more than two views and they're all blurry, explores the perception of his own body through a camera lens. Carrillo tells me that the body is not censored, but the images reflected on mirrors are, as a way to secure preservation, to think after Monique Wittig. So the task is really about trapdoors, challenging the regimes of algorithmic biometrics and automatized recognition. Through the incorporation of tools that were originally intended to beautify, beauty is displaced and oriented towards the desire and embodiment of slimy amorphous surfaces. As Doris Ulick argues, slime is, quote, in science fiction appears commonly in conjunction with aliens standing for the non-human. the unknown that's pressed by flowing, an element that prompts revulsion but equal desire to touch. It is a substance that glues organisms together, creating links between articulations and tissues. Quote, in Carrillo's work, the slimy surfaces invoke an enveloping tactility, while referencing a nonlinear return to a time of materialization. This temporal dislocation takes place in returning to a time frame in which connectivity of tissues creates a protomorphology of a cosmic polydirectional architecture in opacity. In 2016, for many young non-binary people, Facetune provided interesting tools to reframe embodied aesthetics and achieve their desired curatorial presence on Instagram. By exploring the digitized acrylics of the internet, quote, the body navigates a territory that is computational and flesh, blurring the divide between machine and body. Quote, to think after Legacy Russell. The artist, the intelligible architecture of gender dissolves as much as, quote, the thesis of AFA bodies, quote, while simultaneously invoking an erotic tactility. In a reapplication of Glissant, Russell might argue the artist consents not to be seen, but invites us to witness the dispersion of his body within the multiplicities of architectural fragments, thus creating new cosmic cells against captive and coagulated necropolitical algorithms. If the subalternized must be rendered legible within the language of the colonizer, this leaves open the possibility of obliterating legibility, and this possibility is actualized through Carrillo's artwork. His work recognizes that the mechanisms of data encoding are enforced as online algorithms that extend offline can thus break dichotomous relations. While whatever happens online seems to appear only within that framework, it also mirrors what happens away from keyboard. Translation is fugitive to systems of quantification and perceptibility. This makes me return to Quijano, who addresses how subjects are quantified for legibility under capitalism. It is important to understand how the systems of transparent intelligibility operating in this system, which include, quote, measurement, quantification, and externalization or objectification of the knowable in relation to the knowing subject, to control the relations between people and nature, and between people themselves with respect to nature. In particular, the ownership of the means of production. Quote, to think after Lugones, these, quote, cognitive needs of subjectivation, quote, call us to think about capitalist systems of surveillance and the production of modern subjects. The artist Amoral constructs a bikini of mondongo, a meat made from the digestive system of cows, a food staple in Paraguay. Curator Lucia Gaña Rojas relates the choice of material to the ruminant epistemology of Lucrecia Masson. For Lucrecia Masson, quote, cows think with the stomach from the digestive rhythm for the utilization of nutrients. Ritualizing the rhythm of rumination must be done collectively. It is polygastric and it does not privilege conscious state, quote. It is about excessive, overflowing corporealities, which escape from the vertiginous chrononormativity. Anthropometry has been another frontier in pathologizing and regulating bodily forms through the biomedical device. This is particularly significant if we address how the Western worldview has not only built bodily dichotomies through the genitalist epistemic apparatus, but also through establishing Cartesian divisions between mind and body, thus obliterating the forms of perception in collective referentiality, time, and even epigenetic memory. In parallel, the tribe bikini is also a metaphor of the necropolitical ecosystems that pathologize fat and transfeminine transversalities. If we take into account how anthropometric and genitalist worldviews have shaped and regulated the circulation of corporealities in the public scrutiny for the meats that's excessive and at the same time consumed. The work made from an autoethnographic narrative explored the bodily traumas of transphobia due to the effects of the disciplinary politics of the gaze, which, following Fanon, animalizes, pathologizes trans fat femme bodies. The Western gaze and its oculocentric fascination also contributes to the regulation of spaces and which bodies circulate or cease to circulate within them. contemporary respectability politics discipline the expressions of sexuality and gender as they establish collective forms of authoritarian sanction over them in a contemporary form of the Confesionario de Indios. Considering the semiotic aspect of the garment, which covers the regions of the thesis of the traditionally feminine gender, what is exposed here is the flesh, served to be cannibalized by the masses in the mechanisms of contemporary hypervisibility. Transfemininity is cannibalized when sex work is the only choice, but also when expressing sexuality in the domain of cisgender-centered spaces. According to research on trans participation in the formal labor market, transphobia and lack of accessibility to institutional resources often lead to trans people to rely on sex work as a primarily sources of income. As Arena Isura, among others, argue, this leads to the hypersexualization of transfemininity. Isura writes, quote, frequently expressions of transmisogyny encrypt transfemininity as only existing within or for a sexual economy. This allows us to understand transphobia as embedded in transnational circuits of reproductive labor and biopolitical control. The same gender variant bodies on which violence is visited also circulate as valuable within global capital. Quote, this hypersexualization is useful for an economic system that relies on the subjection of certain bodies. As Hika Lee has emphasized, to be a woman is to belong to a globally subaltern category. In Western art, as in capitalism in general, the female body has historically been a tree for sociability and consumption. Even though there's a socially constructed hierarchy dividing cisgender femininity and transfemininity, they are subject to similar dynamics of power and control under the colonial matrix of subjectivation. In mass-produced pornography and mainstream media entertainment, trans-feminine bodies are, quote, coded and packaged as sexually deviant, as monstrous oddities to be consumed at a distance, quote. This is by Sofia Moreno. Transfemininity has been and still is highly sexualized, both aesthetically and economically. This is a theme that Moreno explores in her work, Born Again. In the mid-2000s, when celebrity sex tape scandals in the global north were at the center of pop culture attention, Moreno took her laptop to a computer technician for repair. He stole her private erotic videos from the laptop and sent them to the company where she worked at the time with the aim of exposing her. Following a logic that demonizes her particular body and sexual choices while also endangering her position at the company. At the time, Sophia tells me she worked for the company in order to have access to hormone replacement therapy. Even though she experienced daily transphobia at the company, working there was a, quote, choice, quote, that enabled her long-term self-determination. Faced with this violent attack, Sophia started the film project Born Again, which explores the economy of desire on the internet and the destabilization of the division between private and the public. The theft of her laptop was also a theft of her time, as she had to create new paths to find, quote, autonomy, quote, in the wake of the violent exposure that ensued. The inevitable question is, how do we create art and space for ourselves regardless of these time constraints and genealogies of confinement produced via the transphilia continuum? In the first of Moreno's series, which addresses these questions, opens with a cacophony of voices of heterosexual men who are consuming the exotic spectacle of a female body with a penis. The viewer sees images of a girl touching herself. Private sexuality is now for public display, while faceless men stroke their pink cocks and come in slow motion, which Moreno presents as a recording of a recording. A recurring theme in the series is the appearance of fragmented bodies masturbating when they glimpse at a transfeminine person. An illuminated applause sign faces the audience of a late-night talk show. Quote, you're better than a regular girl, quote, one man says, and we don't know who the speaker is. What is evident is that the power dynamics of sexual exchange involve a certain opacity of identity. In the most recent installment of the series, Born Again Volume 2, Divas from the Underground, Sophia takes us to the Club Divas in San Francisco. The film is a tribute to Filipino and Cambodian trans women who tell Sophia about resistance. It features the artist friends Kia Marcelo Junio and Kei Hong Thomas. voguing and slaying for the audiences and themselves. As Sophia says, the trans body has been used as a muse, but not as a content creator. Quote, it is important for me to consume myself because there is a culture invested in consuming me and it does not know how to do it. As she continues, it is important for me to make art for my community. Quote, Moreno's practice, Moreno's practice explores the body and its mythologies outside the parameters and projections of the cis-colonial framework. Maybe the future is about interconnection of infrastructures with shared political and affective reverberations.